Clara Mae had spent nearly her entire life believing that she was destined to be overlooked. In the quiet corners of Cold Creek, where snow dusted the wooden roofs like powdered sugar in the air, smelled of pine and smoke, she had learned to make herself small, to fade into the background so that no one would notice her flaws. Her body, soft and rounded, had been the source of ridicule since childhood. The whispers of classmates, the laughter behind her back, the pitying smiles of neighbors, all had carved into her a narrative she accepted as truth. Yet despite it all, she carried a gift, one that gave her purpose even when the world refused to see her as worthy. She could cook. Her hands, calloused from years of kneading dough and chopping vegetables, could transform the simplest ingredients into food that nourished not only the body but also the spirit. Children begged for her stews. Men marveled at her pies, and women, some secretly, some openly, admired her skill. But admiration did not equate to love, and Clara knew it. By the time she was 27, she had learned to brace herself for a world that would only ever see her usefulness, never her heart or her beauty. She did not dream of marriage, nor did she entertain thoughts of romance, for in Cold Creek, a woman like her was considered practical but unworthy of desire. So when word spread that Elijah Boone, the reclusive rancher whose lands stretched far north of the ridge, was seeking a wife, Clara initially dismissed it as irrelevant. Elijah Boone was a man of few words and even fewer attachments. He was tall, broad-shouldered, scarred by a life that had been cruel in ways most could not imagine. Women whispered about him with a mixture of awe and fear, some calling him a prize, others a challenge. But none of it had ever reached Clara's ears in a way that made her hope. That is, until her aunt, soft-spoken but fiercely determined, folded a notice into Clara's apron and said, almost tenderly, "You deserve a life too. Clara, don't let them tell you otherwise." The words felt like a foreign currency in her hands, something she had never earned or even dreamed of spending. But for the first time in years, she wondered if she might try. Preparation was a ritual in itself. Clara chose her best dress, a muted blue that complemented her fair skin, and braided her hair meticulously, the golden strands falling in twin ropes over her shoulders. She practiced her words repeatedly, knowing full well that her courage would be tested the moment she faced Elijah Boone. The journey to the ranch was a mixture of anxiety and reluctant hope, the snowy landscape stretching endlessly, silent and unforgiving. When she finally arrived, she found Elijah waiting in the doorway of his main barn, framed by the warm glow of firelight and the soft flurry of snow. His presence was imposing, yet not unkind, and Clara immediately felt her confidence falter. She tried to steady her hands, clutched at the folds of her dress, and stepped forward, voice trembling as she spoke the words that had been rehearsed countless times. "No one marries a fat girl, sir, but I can cook." The words felt like defeat, a surrender to what she had always believed about herself. For a long moment, Elijah said nothing. He studied her carefully, as if weighing not just her appearance, but her very essence. Clara's heart sank. She had expected laughter, mockery, or at the very least, a dismissal. But none came. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "I didn't ask for a bride to impress the town," he said. "I asked for someone who would stay." The simplicity of his words struck her, harder than any insult ever had. In that moment, she did not fully understand, but she sensed that her life had shifted irrevocably. Acceptance did not arrive in a grand declaration or an extravagant gesture. It came quietly in the form of shared chores, long silences that felt comfortable rather than oppressive, and the small rituals of daily life that slowly wove them together. Clara learned that mornings were colder on the ranch, the wind cutting through layers of fabric and skin alike. But there was warmth in Elijah's steady presence, a kind of warmth she had never associated with love. She learned that he did not expect perfection, that he did not measure her worth by her body or by her past mistakes, but by her courage, her consistency, and the way she cared for the people around her. The townsfolk initially reacted with skepticism, their gossip sharp and sometimes cruel. He must have lost his mind, some said. Others whispered that Clara had bewitched him with food alone. But Elijah never flinched. He stood beside her, unwavering, and with his quiet strength. He taught her that love could be patient, steady and quietly transformative. Over weeks and months, Clara's confidence grew. Cooking remained her gift, but she began to see herself beyond the kitchen. She could speak her mind, make decisions, and command respect in ways she had never dared. And in turn, Elijah showed her that strength came not from hiding flaws, but from embracing them, not from seeking approval, but from living honestly. Yet life was never without challenges. Winter storms tested their endurance. The ranch demanded endless labor, and whispers from the town persisted. Clara stumbled more than once, her insecurities threatening to undo the progress she had fought so hard to achieve. But each time, Elijah's words reminded her of the truth she was slowly learning, that her worth was intrinsic, that love was not a reward for beauty or skill, but a recognition of the soul itself. And in those quiet moments, watching the firelight dance across the wooden walls, tasting her own bread fresh from the oven, feeling the rough calluses of her hands, Clara realized something remarkable. She had survived a lifetime of judgment, ridicule, and invisibility. She had claimed her place in a world that had tried to overlook her. She had learned at last that the measure of a person was not what others said or thought, but the courage to exist fully, to give without expectation, and to love without apology. That night, as she looked across the snow-covered yard to where Elijah's silhouette stood, against the darkened landscape, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Hope. Not timid, cautious hope, but the kind that ignites from the understanding that life can change, that hearts can soften, and that even someone long dismissed by the world can become the center of their own story. Clara Mae Boone, once invisible, once convinced that no one could ever truly love her, understood in that moment that she had found not just a husband, but a partner, a witness, and a mirror reflecting the woman she had always been beneath the world's assumptions. And so, the chapter of her life that had been defined by absence, by whispers, and by self-doubt gave way to a new chapter, one where courage, love, and the simplest gifts, a warm meal, a steady hand, a kind word, were enough to carve out a life worth living, a life worth celebrating, and a love worth believing in. Life on Boone Ranch was nothing like Clara had imagined, yet it was everything she had secretly longed for, though she did not know it at the time. The mornings were bitterly cold, the wind slicing across the plains with a cruelty that tested even the strongest lungs, and the chores seemed endless. But there was rhythm to the labor, a kind of poetry in carrying firewood, feeding the animals, and tending the fields, and gradually Clara discovered strength she had never credited herself with. Each day she rose before dawn, wrapping herself in shawls and determination, moving through the frost, as if the cold itself had to recognize her resolve. Elijah Boone was constant, unwavering in his presence, yet never overbearing. He gave her space to learn, to stumble, to grow. When the wind whipped through the barn and snow drifted against the fences, he was beside her silently, a hand on her shoulder, guiding without speaking, trusting her instincts, and quietly teaching her that partnership was not control but support. At first, Clara was consumed by doubt, always waiting for the day he would see her as ordinary, unremarkable, and unworthy of his attention. But that day never came. Instead, she began to notice subtle ways he valued her, not in grand declarations, but in small gestures. A nod at the right moment, a shared smile over a well-prepared meal, the way he deferred to her when she suggested improvements to the way the ranch was run. Slowly, Clara began to see herself as he did, not simply as the woman who could cook, but as a woman whose presence mattered, whose decisions carried weight, whose heart was not just capable of loving, but deserving of it. And yet, life beyond the ranch tested her in ways she could never have predicted. The townspeople, at first skeptical of her marriage to Elijah, began to murmur in the shadows, their words sharp, sometimes cruel, often laced with envy or disbelief. "He must be lonely," some whispered. Or blinded, others sneered. Children she had once comforted with her stews now stared at her curiously, as if searching for cracks in the armor of her new confidence. Some mornings, Clara would wake with a heaviness pressing against her chest, a reminder of all the years she had believed herself invisible. She had thought the hardest part of life had been surviving rejection and ridicule, but she quickly realized that surviving scrutiny when you are finally seen is just as challenging. It was during one of those bitter winters, when the snow had piled so high that the fences disappeared and the livestock were thin and weary, that Clara faced the moment that would define her not just as a wife, but as a force of her own making. A neighboring family, proud and stubborn, had come to her doorstep, their faces tight with hunger and humiliation. Their children were thin, their spirits low, and the parents refused to ask for help outright. Yet Clara could see the desperation hidden behind their pride. Without hesitation, she began to prepare meals, working through the night, stirring massive pots of stew, kneading bread until her hands ached, and packing parcels for delivery. Elijah watched her tirelessly, a mix of admiration and quiet awe in his expression, and when she finally slumped into a chair, exhausted and trembling, he knelt beside her and said simply, "You are feeding more than stomachs. You are feeding hope." The words sank into Clara's heart like sunlight through frost, and she realized that this was the life she had always been meant to lead, not unnoticed, not ignored, but vital, necessary, and respected. Months passed. Spring arrived slowly, dripping over the snow-covered plains like a promise. Clara's reputation grew, not as a woman defined by her size, her past, or her appearance, but as a woman whose presence made a tangible difference. Neighbors who had once sneered now sought her guidance, her counsel, her steady hand in times of crisis. Some women who had dismissed her now asked for her recipes, her advice on running a household, and slowly, Clara's influence extended beyond the ranch into the town itself. Yet power and respect did not erase old wounds. Clara still faced whispers in the marketplace, judgment in the church pews, and the occasional cruel remark in passing. But each time she remembered Elijah's words, the steady faith he placed in her, and the truth she had fought so hard to claim, that her worth existed independent of others' opinions. One evening, after a long day of work, tending both the ranch and the neighboring families, Clara sat on the porch with Elijah, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly, not about their marriage, but about the path she had chosen, the courage she had summoned to step into visibility. Elijah turned to her, his eyes steady, and said, "I don't, but you might regret not knowing how strong you are until now." The words made her smile softly, a rare, unguarded smile, and she realized that this journey through fear, doubt, and societal judgment had forged a version of herself she had never imagined. She was resilient, capable, and worthy of love and admiration. But it wasn't only about recognition, it was about impact. When drought threatened the crops later that year, it was Clara who organized community meals, rationed food, and ensured that no child went hungry. When sickness spread through the town, it was Clara who stayed by the bedsides of the sick, who comforted the grieving, who reminded everyone that humanity was measured not by wealth or appearance, but by compassion and action. And through it all, Elijah remained steadfast, never taking credit, never overshadowing her, simply standing as witness to her growth, a partner in every sense. The transformation in Clara's life was profound, not because the world finally accepted her, but because she had accepted herself. She had claimed her worth through labor, kindness, courage, and steadfastness. She had discovered that love was not about perfection, beauty, or skill. It was about being seen, acknowledged, and valued for exactly who you are, flaws and all. And as the years unfolded, Clara Mae Boone, the woman who once believed no one would marry her, the woman who once thought her life was destined for invisibility, became a legend in her own right, not for the food she cooked, though it nourished countless souls, but for the strength she embodied, the hope she inspired, and the quiet revolution she led simply by daring to exist fully, honestly and courageously. People began to speak her name not with pity or mockery, but with respect, admiration, and sometimes awe. And Clara, for the first time in her life, no longer felt the sting of invisibility. She had transformed, not because someone had changed their mind about her, but because she had changed her mind about herself. She had taken the life she had been given, with all its hardships and imperfections, and turned it into something remarkable. And as she watched the sunset, hand in hand with Elijah, she realized that the greatest gift she had ever been given was not marriage, nor was it skill, nor recognition. It was the courage to claim her own story, to define her own worth, and to step into a world that had once dismissed her and say, finally with certainty and pride, I belong here, I'm enough, and my life is mine to shape. If you feel inspired by Clara's journey, if her courage and resilience speak to something deep inside you, remember this: you too have a story worth telling, a life worth living boldly, and strength you may not yet have discovered. Subscribe to the channel and follow along for more stories of ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage, of love that transforms, and of lives changed not by circumstance, but by daring to claim their worth.